Fellow travelers, welcome back to the slow light of history. The city exhales differently when it knows it must let go. You stand on the quay before dawn, wind taking the edge off your words. Salt rides the air like a thin veil, the timbers smell of tar and rope. Lamps gutter in alleys that remember gold and ink and the quiet arithmetic of empires. Behind you, the Baixa is waking, shop shutters scraping, the baker's lantern sliding across cobbles. But today those ordinary motions bear an extra weight, the sound of boots and the whisper of papers being gathered. When the decision came to move the royal household across the ocean, it arrived like a physical thing, sealed orders, ministers' faces pulled tight, the rustle of ledgers closed for the last time. In late autumn 1807, with French columns moving through Iberia and diplomacy fracturing, Lisbon bent itself to an extraordinary act. The Prince Regent João, already governing in his mother's name, did not simply flee. He carried the institutional heart of a monarchy with him. Palace servants fold ceremonial robes into trunks with the habit of ritual. Clerks inventory seals and state papers by candlelight. Outside, river traffic thickens. Small boats with canvas flaring, barges loaded with crates, a naval escort already marking the harbor's edge. Shopkeepers lock doors and linger to watch the procession that will crowd the embankment. Merchants, who had kept the city fed and clothed, move between their ledgers and the quay, arranging hurried consignments for the voyage. The day is peculiar because the ordinary persists inside the extraordinary. A chestnut seller balances hot tins on a shawl, while a chamberlain hurries past with a crate of silver. Intimacy and statecraft braid together. A pageboy ties a ribbon he cannot imagine leaving. A lady wraps a miniature in linen and places it in a trunk meant for exile. Such private acts make the departure feel human rather than merely political. The choice to cross the Atlantic is strategic as much as it is emotional. Portugal faces a squeeze. French troops press into Spain and the diplomatic map is being redrawn. Removing the court preserves legal continuity and keeps imperial connections afloat. Still, the logistics are immense. State papers and seals are packed in oak chests. Portraits are wrapped and numbered. Household silver is crated and inventoried by clerks who work with the mechanical patience of men used to counting things that do not change. On the quays, dockworkers heave trunks that smell of lavender and old paper. They exchange no words with passing nobles. Their gaze holds the river's lip, as if trying to memorize a shoreline that will soon be left behind. Sailors swing coils of rope with a rhythm older than the politics that sent these people aboard. A naval lieutenant checks manifests with a practiced eye, noting names and numbers that will govern passage across the ocean. As boarding begins, the scene compresses. Ropes are thrown, carts are driven aside, a hush moves through the crowd like a tide. The palace chapel hosts a brief service. A cleric whispers a blessing over trunks while a handful of courtiers press their palms to carved pews. Outside, a child stands with a toy ship, watching vessels that will carry the monarchy away without understanding why the city suddenly feels different. The fleet is an awkward convoy of royal transports, merchantmen adapted for passengers and naval escorts. A cutter's bell rings for departure. Men on deck haul lines. A gangway clangs. You feel the quay vibrate as a vessel answers her anchors. Water laps in new places. Ropes sigh, gulls wheel and pierce the sky with their calls. From sterns, the chamberlains wave handkerchiefs. From cabin tops, standards dip. The city watches, eyes dry or wet depending on the viewer. They push off, and the Tagus takes them. Lisbon, used to imagining itself as a center turning outward, watches one of its central organs lift and go. The docks remain. An economy adjusting, a citizenry unpacking sudden absence. For merchants, for clerks, for seamstresses, life will continue, but the rhythm will be altered. The court's departure is not an erasure so much as a forceful relocation of authority. Yet this movement is only the first fold of consequence. Crossing the Atlantic is not escape from Europe's politics, but a relocation of its grammar. The court will arrive in a new place and change it. Ports will open, courts will sit in new halls, and colonial rhythms will bend toward the presence of monarchy. For now, the concern is immediate and nautical. The convoy must clear shoals, find favorable winds, and hope that sea and sails conspire more kindly than human designs. A low drum rolls from a warship on the starboard side. The lead transport gathers way. Somewhere upriver, a messenger runs with one more sealed packet, an instruction that might change a dispatch, delay a commander, or reorder a harbor's plan. The fleet's wake widens into a pale ribbon under a sky that is thinning toward morning. The city recedes. On deck, faces turn to the land they leave. A chamberlain folds a letter into his sleeve. Behind them, Lisbon's stones will remember this morning in ways that later memorials cannot. Small gestures, a child's toy, a baker's paused loaf. The voyage begins, but the imprint of departure has already been made. Across the water, the next chapter waits, with weather, politics, and strangers' eyes ready to test what exile will make of a kingdom. They work like people who know time is being stolen from them. In a back room of the palace, a lamp burns low. Dust hangs in the beam when a clerk moves a hand. The air tastes faintly of lavender and old paper. Trunks stand open like waiting mouths. Crimson cloth, gilt frames, boxes of seals, and bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon. The ritual of packing is bureaucratic and intimate at once. A chamberlain calls each item aloud, while another reads from a long, cramped inventory. The words sound like a litany. Mirror, portrait, seal, chest of silver, state papers, private correspondence. And each entry is answered with a measured nod. The monarchy does not travel light. Authority is a thing of objects as much as of persons. The seals that mark royal decrees, the wax-stamped warrants, the codices of law. These must be preserved if legitimacy is to survive a crossing. Clerks wrap parchment in oiled linen. They place official registers in stout oak boxes and tie them with cord. Some items are purely symbolic. Scepters and crowns are boxed and padded, their metal gleam dimmed under layers of tissue. Others are practical and mortal. Ledgers that bind creditors and suppliers, lists of naval pensions, rolls of colonial appointments. Lose the papers, and you risk losing the machine of state. There is a tension between public and private lists. Official inventories sit next to intimate stacks. A lady's pressed shawls, a miniature portrait from a dead husband, a child's toy boat. Servants move between these worlds. A footman lifts a velvet cushion while glancing for the look that will tell him whether this belongs to the queen's morning room or the private chamber. The corridors hum with a kind of controlled panic. A lady in waiting holds a letter against her lips before she folds it into a small chest. The act feels like an absolution. Specialists come and go. The librarian, a thin man with ink at his nail beds, supervises the selection of books. Libraries are weight and memory. Shelves are measured and catalogued. Folios are wrapped in brown paper and packed in straw. The Royal Library's volumes will form a single traveling archive of culture and law. The librarian marks each trunk with a code in a trembling hand, as if the ink itself were a prayer. He knows that books are not merely cargo, but a kind of civic heart. To uproot them is to move a city's memory. Meanwhile, the mint and treasury require a different language. Boxes of coin are inventoried under watchful eyes. Banknotes, receipts, and bills of exchange are sealed and chained. Men with sober faces count and double count. Gold clinks in wooden cases, a sound that mutters of value and fear. For those arranging finance, the sea is a ledger that can be unsettled by storms, privateers, and plain loss. The risk calculus is constant. How much to carry, how much to leave in local vaults, what must be transferred to Brazil if royal authority is to function there. Artisans stand by to create paintings and sculptures. Canvases are wrapped in oiled cloth. Frames are removed and packed flat to save space and reduce strain. A portrait of the monarch is carefully labeled "Royal," do not display without order, and yet its presence on the voyage will be less about vanity than about continuity. If the court is to re-establish itself, faces must travel with names. And then there are the human instruments of court: governesses, secretaries, stewards, the royal surgeon, cooks, grooms. Household staffs draw up lists of who must accompany the family, who may stay, and who ought to be left behind. Some choices are practical, who can manage a royal bed at sea, and some are social, whose presence marks status. Porters negotiate who carries what. A favored valet takes charge of a chest of clothing, stitched with the monarch's initials. The scene is part military exercise, part domestic chaos. Men and women move with the double posture of haste and ceremony. Secrecy shapes how things are packed. Orders restrict who may know the destination, and messengers travel with sealed envelopes. Some trunks are labeled plainly, others are masked with mundane tags to hide their importance. The fear of interception is real. Warships prowl the seas, and privateers, or worse, the French patrols that have remapped the peninsula, could turn a ship's manifest into a casualty list. For this reason, a small detachment of Navy officers supervise loading, measuring the weight distribution, ensuring bales are lashed, and chests chained to the deck. Every object packed carries a small moral freight. Papers that list colonial appointments read like maps of human lives. Who will govern the ports? Who will collect duties? Which offices will carry the crown's reach? Transport those documents and you transport governance. Leave them behind and you risk administrative paralysis. A clerk pauses at a ledger detailing the revenue from sugar and tobacco, commodities whose fortunes depend on a transatlantic supply chain that the court's presence both stabilizes and complicates. The press and instruments of communication are a particular worry. Brazil has been a colony without the full apparatus of publication that European capitals enjoy. The court's ability to print decrees, to issue proclamations, to exchange legal orders depends on type, paper, presses. Plans are made, and here uncertainty grows, about which materials can be carried and how rapidly a printing office can be set up after arrival. The men packing these supplies debate the practicalities in low tones. The decisions they make will determine how quickly the monarchy can legislate from a new shore. Children complicate logistics with their small needs. A prince's nurse stows toys and medicines. A scrawl of a child's doodle will be wrapped and taken as if it were a talisman. Horses and carriages are harder. Many equerries decide that saddles and harnesses must go aboard, while whole carriages might be left to local agents or sold. The procession's visible glamour must be balanced against the cramped reality of a ship's hold. As the final chests are nailed shut and numbered, a hush falls in the packing room. A clerk signs the last line of an inventory with an exhausted hand. There is a peculiar sound in that moment, wood closing on wood, rope tightening on trunk lids, like a book being snapped shut on a chapter. Yet even as things are sealed, a question remains unclosed. Which parts of a kingdom's life can be carried, and which must be reinvented in a new place? For the men and women who tape, tie, and box, the answer is not yet clear. The key is a city's throat. Things pass through it that do not pass elsewhere. Morning oil lamps are still smudges when the first carts rattle across the stone. The air is sharp with coal smoke, and the sweet bruised smell of oranges from a merchant's crate. Men who work the water, stevedores, lightermen, coopers, move with a practiced indifference to ceremony. They have watched governors come and go as reliably as the tide. Today is different because the currents of authority have slipped off their accustomed course, but their hands still know how to sling a bale and stitch a sail. A merchant at his desk the day before might have been counting duties and watching credit lines. Now he stands on the quay, arms folded, watching the royal convoy's ribbon of wake. For him, the court's absence will be practical as well as symbolic. Trade depends on certainty. Contracts must be enforced, tariffs collected, ports licensed. The court's moving hand changed the axis of those concerns. Ships that once received routine permissions now face new protocols. Customs officers, long the city's quiet magistrates, find their roles recast. The seal's absence means provisional measures. Deputies read from old warrants, stamps are improvised. And clerks walk between offices and warehouses delivering decrees scrawled by hand. Paperwork flows differently when the source of authority is on another ocean. Amid this readjustment, life at the quays keeps its own economy. A woman sells salt cod from under a tattered blanket. Boys run with messages between ships. A cooper mends a keg with focused patience. Merchant houses keep a close eye on inventory. Sugar in casks stamped with plantation marks. Bolts of cloth wrapped in linen and waiting for brokers. The handshake between supply and demand continues, yet with a sharper edge. The physical work of changing port life is small but cumulative. Wharf masters adjust timetables. Small boatmen take on extra runs ferrying passengers and letters upriver to where new registries are being set. The harbor's taverns, previously humming with sailors and clerks, shift tone. Talk now includes rumors of press gangs, of French patrols off the estuary, of which vessels sailed safely the night before. News is currency here. Rumor travels faster than any seal, and a single whispered bulletin can halt business as effectively as an official order. Crime adapts too. Where authority thins, boldness grows. Smugglers find opportunity in cluttered records. A missing manifest can be explained by the chaos of relocation. For some local entrepreneurs, the court's absence is a chance to expand routes or bid for contracts once monopolized by crown suppliers. They move like chess players, placing pieces, quiet, deliberate, always calculating gain against risk. There is an odd intimacy between the grand and the small here. A clerk who has labored over a register for decades opens his ledger to find new entries penciled in by a deputy. The metallic anxiety of ink is visible in his hands. A fisherwoman whose name does not appear in any state record watches foreign officers walking the docks. People learn fast that law is a living thing, one that can be carried across an ocean but needs hands to enact it. Cargo itself tells stories. A bale of textiles smells faintly of dyes in the hands that stitched it. A crate of medical supplies bears the stamp of a military hospital. Boxes of books from the Royal Library carry the must of late nights. These items become portable evidences of a nation's reach. For a port accustomed to being a relay, the court's departure means many things will now travel in the opposite direction. Petitions for offices, commissions, appeals for favors that once required personal presence. Not all goods move equally. Sugar and tobacco, tied to colonies and credit lines, require steady oversight. The absence of familiar licensing means merchants must secure extra bonds. The shadow of European navies alters insurance rates, and therefore the price of risk. Merchants posture accordingly, haggling with underwriters and listening to brokers with an attentive eye. The human dimension is visible in small, tangible ways. A dockside tavern hosts a table where sailors' wives stitch garments for sea. Their conversation skips from gossip to pressing topics. Did they take the surgeon? Will the bread tax be enforced from Brazil? Their stitches are counterpoints to the bureaucratic packing that filled court trunks. They make small acts of care against an unsettled world. Quieter acts of mourning happen without ceremony. A seamstress who embroidered court caps tears one apart to remake a child's coat. A coachman leaves a stable for a longer route, finding work shuttling goods between warehouses because royal carriages will not pass his hands for months. Lives recalibrate, skills repurpose, loyalties renegotiate, and the city's social map redraws in the space created by a departing court. Still, uncertainty remains. News arrives slowly from the fleet, delays from wind, a sighting near the burr, a rumor of privateers. Each bulletin contracts attention. Business pauses while men listen. The harbor, which had expected a pattern of arrivals and departures, now watches the sea like someone who has lost a familiar face. At twilight, lanterns blink along the quay, and the day's industry slackens. Workers exchange coins and tattered smiles. Someone calls the name of a sailor who will not return for a season. Upstairs, a merchant widens a ledger's margins and draws a new column simply titled Risk. The city's pulse steadies, but it is steadied with a new rhythm, one that keeps an eye on the ocean and a ledger open to contingencies. The harbor keeps a different sort of silence when ships prepare to answer history. Before the first rope is cast off, there is a choreography to be learned. Boats are measured by their timbers and temperament. Captains and owners negotiate terms with a mixture of brass and apology. Mariners measure holds and calculate ballast, as if doing sums that will decide lives. The royal operation folds into the everyday industry of a port. Transport ships are chartered, naval frigates position themselves at the mouth of the estuary, and merchantmen used to carrying sugar and cloth are refitted to receive trunks, people, and the fragile architecture of a government. Requisition papers travel like ghosts through offices. A naval lieutenant posts orders on a weathered board. The port registry ticks names into lists. A contractor receives coin and signs his name in a hurry. Men who usually argue over tonnage suddenly find themselves talking about packing crates with legal seals. Shipwrights hammer and caulk by lamplight, patching seams and measuring lines. Sailors curse under breath and check hammocks, thinking in knots and rhythms. How much canvas will hold? How will a heavy trunk stowed forward change the way a ship heels? The naval presence is visible, not merely as show, but as necessity. Warships anchor in a loose ring around the transports, their decks crowded with Marines and with the restless business of preparation. Gunnery crews run down powder stores, officers pace with dispatches rolled under their arms. The Navy's role is practical: escort against privateers, a measure of deterrence against the unpredictable sea of European conflict. But it is also symbolic. A sovereign moves under protection, and the world watches. Loading proceeds along strange priorities. Trunks of state papers and boxed regalia are treated like fragile cargo. Meanwhile, staples of life, flour, salted meat, barrels of wine, fresh water, are stowed in bulk as if preparing for a long winter. A royal kitchen's requisition list reads like a map of domestic order. Spices, preserved fish, casks of oil, crates for a bakery yet to be set up. Horses are shod and led, saddles lashed to beams. Skeletons of carriages may be left to agents ashore, and servants haggle with ship captains over the space for trunks marked with initials. There are last-minute bargains you can feel in the air. A merchant captain demands extra coin for speed. A ship owner refuses to take silver jars that cannot be properly lashed. An underwriter writes a heavy premium on a manifest, and the clerk rubs his forehead and adds a column to the ledger. Private interest, public urgency, they mingle like wine and smoke. Not everybody boards willingly. Some courtiers decline the voyage for reasons of age, ill health, or principle. Others are dismissed to remain as local administrators, left behind to handle matters that must be managed where the people remain. The selection of who goes is itself political. Those close to the regent, those essential to the court's operation, and those whose skills, printers, surgeons, naval officers, cannot be left in the rear. For many attendants, the decision to go was not only about loyalty, but about survival. A peculiar traffic of animals and domestic oddities threads through the bustle. A chest of silks, a crate of botanical specimens, a caged parrot squawks from a lighter, a groom fusses over a chestnut mare. The court imagines recreating household order across the sea. These small reliquaries of domestic life are what soften the practical austerity of an exile. Communication is strained to secrecy. Messengers arrive with sealed packets that are immediately passed to an officer and tucked away. The docks bristle with watchers, curious citizens, spies, agents for foreign powers. So, discretion matters. There are whispered conversations in taverns where rumor might become strategy. One hears accounts of a British squadron assigned to shepherd the convoy, but the exact composition and command are sometimes unclear in surviving contemporary notes. Where record is thin, we must state uncertainty plainly. It is certain, though, that naval coordination is a central piece. Without it, the convoy risks interception or delay. At midday, the harbor's rhythm shifts. A signal gun booms from a warship, and men look up. Boats with clerks scurry to arrange last manifests. A rope ladder rattles against a transport's hull as a courier is passed aboard. The naval officers make final inspections: ropes, gun carriages, stowage plans. On deck, sailors lash trunks to timbers and half-breath in prayer. The texture of hemp, salt, and tallow fills the mouth like an old taste. At the center of the operation, there is always a small, guarded space. An office on a warship or a cabin where high orders are read. Here, the logistics meet the state. Here, a minister bends over a map and traces a route with a finger, steadying himself against the wave of consequences. These cramped councils decide where the convoy will rendezvous, which coast to hug, when to make for the open ocean. Sometimes the answers are made with incomplete knowledge. Weather, enemy movements, and the simple unpredictability of the sea introduce variables no man can fully control. The social theater of the quay is vivid. Noble ladies stand under cloaks that have been hastily adjusted. A bishop pins a stole against his chest as if it were armor. Younger officers swagger and check uniforms that will be photographed by memory rather than canvas. Children cling to the hems of gowns while servants carry family Bibles. All the while, the ordinary populace keeps watching, with an attention that is almost a body's reflex. They have been interpolated into history by circumstance. As the sun falls, the convoy tightens its lines. Ropes creak with final knots. A boat returns to shore with a last dispatch. A single courier wrapped in sea smell and blowing air, face lined by tide. He carries news the docks will not yet open to the public. Contemporary chronicles mention last-minute orders and changing rendezvous points. Where sources differ, we note it, because the record is a palimpsest of certainty and conjecture. The harbor holds its breath. What the courier whispers aboard will determine whether the convoy slips quietly toward open sea or waits for one more line to be tied. Night makes the sea an honest thing, black, indifferent, and at once honest. They slip the last lines as dusk slides from the city. Lanterns pop from cabins and the glow pools on decks like soft coins. The river narrows into a throat. The estuary opens its arms and begins to test the convoy's mettle. On deck, the air is colder now, a skin of salt and spray that kisses faces and stiffens fingers. Men pull oilskins tight. Women press shawls close. Children whose sleep is still fragile clutch small comforts hidden in trunks. The movement away from land is a movement into a different kind of privacy, a world bounded by horizon and the rules of seamanship. Sailors move with the small rituals that steady fear. They heave on halyards in rhythm. They knot and kiss rope. They listen for the creak that announces a strain beyond what the wood will bear. The captain's voice is steady but thin. Orders are given and repeated like prayers. The watch alternates. Some sleep in hammock slings, the rest keep vigil, scanning the seam where sky meets water. The sea smells of iron and wet canvas. It tastes of trade winds and something older, a maritime memory of storms and strange lights. Navigation at night is a practiced negotiation. Compasses hum under brass housings. Officers check dead reckoning against the feel of wind and the roll of the vessel. The convoy tries to keep formation, but ships have minds of their own. A heavily laden transport will answer the swell differently than a swift cutter full of Marines. Lanterns are kept low to avoid signaling to eyes that should not be watching. Every light is a decision, comfort for the human inside, a sign to those outside. Weather sits like an unannounced guest. Some nights the ocean receives the fleet with a soft breath, a wind steady enough to move canvas and not knives. Other nights the swell rises and the convoy learns its fragile mathematics of balance. Sailors note the odor of approaching squalls. The clamor of a reef will be visible in gull behavior or the sudden hiss of waves. Men on watch exchange terse phrases. By the wind, steady her, trim that sail. And the ship becomes a conversation of timbers and knots. There is a particular loneliness to the ocean at night. The city, Lisbon, remains a faint smear of memory to those watching land recede. Lights blink and then resolve into nothing. The last silhouette of the quay drops beneath the horizon, like a body sinking into sleep. Those who remain ashore will speak of the fleet's vanished wake, as if it were an injury to the map. Those aboard feel its neat cruelty in their ribs. For courtiers, it is the sudden compression of space. A room once measured by palace windows is now measured by a cabin lantern and the distance to the nearest rail. On the larger ships, the machinery of government continues. Ministers hold councils below decks. A map table is lit by tallow and the soft scratch of a pen. They tally cargo, read the latest dispatches, and plan where proclamations might be made upon arrival. But the ship's rolling translates words into liquid impressions. A line that reads clearly in ink may blur when motion becomes argument. A clerk's hand learns to anchor itself to the grain of the wood to hold a steady script. Seafaring life reshapes the court. Ceremonial order must adapt to a sea timetable. Meals, once lengthy and deliberate, become fast and practical. The royal kitchen improvises with staples that keep and with small preserves to suggest continuity. A silver cup is used like any tin mug. A folding table may hold a minister's map and a surgeon's instruments in the same space. The small rituals of governance, the signing of a seal, the reading of a brief, are performed with the same careful gravity but with an awareness of spray and salt. Sailors and courtiers meet across small boundaries. A cabin boy, cheeks wasted by the wind, may be sent with a message to a minister below, and on deck a steward may ask a sailor about the best place to lash a bulky chest. These encounters are quiet collisions of worlds, one shaped by the sea's blunt law, the other by the softer ceremonial code of court. They hum with mutual curiosity, courtly curiosity for competence, maritime curiosity for table manners, and sometimes with impatience. Threats are rarely absent. Privateers and enemy cruisers patrol European waters at this time. The convoy carries a naval ring for protection, but the sea itself is as dangerous. Shoals eat hulls, uncharted banks wait like teeth, and weather turns a procession into chaos faster than any cannon shot. Men count on charts that are imperfect, and on pilots who have knowledge carved by repetition into their hands. At night, the margin for navigational error narrows. A miscalculation of tide or a misreadable star can send a laden ship scudding toward a shoal. Fear operates privately and collectively. In the hush of a night watch, a seaman might flinch at a wave that sounds unnervingly like a breaking branch. In the cabin below, a noblewoman might hold a child and whisper stories of saints to frame the dark. On more than one voyage of similar era, small superstitions travel as currency. A particular biscuit for luck, a coin pinned to a hem, or a prayer tucked under a cushion. These small acts stitch the human texture of a state to the ragged seam of the ocean. There are practical moments that reveal the voyage's strain. The surgeon makes rounds, checking for seasickness, the great equalizer at sea. Men and women who can command a room on shore may be rendered helpless by the simplest lurch. Stores are counted as often as letters. Supplies must be conserved because the Atlantic is a long ledger. In the mess, a steward measures rations not only by need, but by the knowledge that replenishment might be weeks or months away. Time at sea has its own sense, an elastic span where days are measured by watches and weather rather than sunrise alone. The human body adapts, but memory keeps track of the small markers. The last sight of the Tagus Cliffs, a particular constellation, sighted on an uneventful night. The day when a child's cough first sounded fretful. These marks will later populate journals and dispatches and the private scrapbooks of those who cross. Near midnight, the lead frigate signals a course change. Officers move with efficient urgency. Ropes thrum like tightened nerves. The convoy answers, sails trim, and the fleet threads another stretch of dark water. For a moment the world feels narrow and all at once intimate. The convoys wake a path of pale foam. The sky a dome of indifferent stars. Land is gone. Behind them lie the architecture of a familiar life. Ahead lies uncertainty, and, for some, the faint promise of a shore that may welcome or encounter them with its own politics. The ocean begins to remind the convoy that geography is never neutral. Coasts are not merely lines on a chart. They are living hazards, reefs that reach like hidden teeth, currents that curve with an old stubbornness, fogs that arrive without apology. As the fleet moves down the Iberian coast and finally opens its bows toward the Atlantic swell, pilots consult charts and memory in equal measure. Mariners read color in the water, the way foam threads a channel, and the light on a distant headland that will tell them whether a lee shore waits or a safe passage opens. Wind shifts that were small the day before can sharpen into a different grammar. A steady westerly that favored leaving the Tagus may slacken or veer, demanding tacks and burns that test seamanship and patience. Sailors chatter in tight phrases, luff her, bring the staysail, heave to, and the convoy answers with a choreography honed by repetition. The larger transports, deep with trunks and chests, heave more slowly. The cutters and frigates cut through a shorter roll, their crews nimble and alert. The sea plays each vessel differently, and the officers learn its temper the hard way. Visibility becomes a traitor in fear. Fog can appear like an enormous hand closing on the sea. In such conditions, the convoy tightens, lanterns dim, and sound takes over where sight fails. A bell on a buoy or the muffled boom of a warship's gun gives coordinates to the ear. But sound is treacherous on water. It bends and delays, and men can be misled by echoes. Without clear sight, the risk of striking a submerged hazard rises, and every captain measures his conscience against his chart. Storms have personalities. Some arrive fast, with little more than a horizon's bruise to warn. Others build like argument, a long negotiation of cloud and swell. A storm's first gift is motion. The predictable roll becomes a violent arc, and trunks shift in their lashings. Men lash down what they can, secure loose gear, and pray to practical gods. Stews stow themselves with extraordinary speed. Surgeons check their medicines. Carpenters inspect knees and mortises for the places a hull might complain. In an Atlantic gale, a ship's timbers speak in loud tones, the creak of strained planks, the clatter of unsecured metal, the groan of a mast receiving a punishment it was built against but did not expect. Sailors lash themselves into safety or ride the decks with a terrible calm. Orders are shouted over the roar. The officer's voice is a thin wire that must hold under strain. Men who once argued in coffeehouse calm now move with the bluntness of people acting to forestall catastrophe. Seawater works like an eraser on certainties. Salt corrodes rope and iron, softens paper at the edges, and eats the sheen off opulence. Royal silks, once proudly folded, emerge damp and salted. Ink bleeds on documents if waterproofing failed. The bureaucratic machine must adapt to material failures. Dispatches must be rewritten, seals re-waxed, and inventories adjusted where things are damaged or lost. The convoy's defensive posture matters more amid weather. A storm thins a protective ring. Escort frigates must decide whether to stay close to ensure safety or to spread out to reduce collision risk. The calculus is painful. Keep the ring tight and risk ships crushing one another in rough seas, or allow distance and risk exposure to privateers when visibility returns. Decisions like this, recorded in various contemporary accounts of similar voyages, show how commanders balance the immediate mechanical threat of weather with the strategic threat of enemy action. Human endurance registers in small ways. Seamen who seem stalwart on fair days find themselves white-faced with exhaustion. Courtiers who could command a dining room may be unable to stand on a rolling deck. Children vomit into the tarred seams. Old men who had a lifetime ashore mutter prayers with unfamiliar cadence. The surgeon's work grows practical: bind wounds, hold fevers, and tend to those whose constitution cannot bear the ocean's long pressure. Repairs happen under duress. A sprung seam may need urgent caulking. A detached spar requires a jury-rigged brace. The convoy's carpenters and sailmakers become critical to survival. Working on a heaving deck in a gale is one of the world's cruelest labors. To hold a board steady while the hull rises and falls requires muscles trained in both strength and timing. A lost spar cannot always be replaced at sea. Sometimes it must be cut away to save the mast, a painful but necessary sacrifice. Beyond the mechanics, there are moral costs. Cargo lost into the black teeth of waves sometimes contains not only cloth and coin, but documents that hold names, appointments, letters, ledgers that map human lives. Each lost chest is a ripple in governance. An absent signature can unravel a ship of state into legal fog. The court's clerks learn the hard arithmetic that a drowned ledger introduces to colonial administration. Yet storms also bring moments of shared humanity. Sailors and courtiers, exhausted and cold, may huddle in the same narrow berths and exchange stories. A minister might share a bread ration with a deckhand, and that single act becomes a small icon of solidarity. Such gestures do not fix the larger problems, but they render the crossing legible as a collaged human effort, not solely as the movement of power. When the convoy skirts the rugged headlands and opens into broader water, the charts reveal a danger that tightens the fleet's throat. A notorious shoal marked on several pilot charts, a bank that has wrecked ships in prior seasons. The lead frigate hails a signal to alter course, and officers gather with maps spread under oilcloth, rain whispering at the edges. To thread the shoal would save days but risk hulls. To give it a wide berth would add time that the Regent would rather not squander. The council will meet at dawn to decide, and until then, the fleet holds itself like a held breath. The ocean's long spine is punctuated by islands that act like breath stops in a marathon. After days of open sea, the convoy sights land as a promise and a question. Islands rise out of blue like dark punctuation marks. Cliffs, green caps, and harbors that promise wood, water, and fresh vegetables, things that taste like home. For many aboard, the first glimpse of an island is a relief so physical it loosens the chest. A gull wheels, and men point with wet fingers. The smell of grass and rain on earth, when it reaches a vessel, feels almost indecent after weeks of salt. Approach to an island is a ritual. Pilots are summoned, charts are unfolded and compared to memory. Small boats sound the channels. Sails ease, crews unlash, voices lower. The work of disembarkation starts. Gangways drop, feet find rock with cautious gratitude, and hammocks are slung to dry. Fresh water is hauled, barrels of citrus are cracked open. A baker's oven, if one is aboard or nearby, makes fragrant loaves that banish the taste of ship's biscuit. Local towns perform for this passing court with commerce and ceremony. Merchants wheel out jugs and produce. Innkeepers press rooms into service. Artisans offer restitched boots and patched saddles. The arrival is spectacle and market. Merchants look for coin, captains for supplies, local officials for favor. Quick festivals can appear, a flag raised, a cannon fired in welcome. Small performances that both flatter and feed the convoy. But islands test cohesion. Harbors are narrow, shallow banks hide like teeth. Currents run treacherous in channels that to shore look calm. Moving dozens of vessels into a single anchorage is a study in diplomacy. Captains haggle for space. Naval officers issue orders. Smaller boats thread between hulls. A misplaced anchor can tangle chains and force ships to bump with humiliating intimacy. The naval discipline that held on open water faces new challenges in a crowded cove. The human geography of an island stop is immediate. Sailors stretch legs and buy tobacco. Clerks run to post offices. A surgeon barters for fresh herbs to treat fever. Servants wash linen in freshwater streams. A governess takes children for a shore walk to pick shells and snap twigs. Social boundaries blur. A common soldier and a chamberlain may share a bench while watching nets come in, and conversations skip from port gossip to supplies to news from home. Supply is brittle. Markets may be thin or recently stripped by prior calls. Sometimes a port cannot meet the convoy's needs. Stores are rationed, officers decide which goods to spare, and the surgeon marks how nutrition shifts among ranks. A shortage of fresh meat or citrus narrows patience and frays temper. Scurvy is a slow specter, and officers know how rapidly morale can decline when larders run low. Diplomatic microdrama plays out in taverns and on key steps. Island captains or governors, dependent on Lisbon's favor, decide how far to bend to the passing regent. They issue pilots, warehouse space, or temporary storage in exchange for promises that may never be kept. The court's presence temporarily reorders local hierarchies. Small officials bask in reflected power, and local rivalries reconfigure to courtly advantage. These exchanges leave traces in petitions, receipts, and later complaints. Tender human moments appear too. An old fisherman, hearing the court surgeon needs herbs, leads a boy up a hillside to gather oregano and chamomile, guided by a generosity older than politics. A seamstress mends a nurse's apron and becomes the keeper of letters folded into hems. These small acts, absent from formal dispatches, stitch together the relocation in ways official records rarely show. One anchorage yields a memorable scene, a wet market by the quay where citrus peels gleam like jewels against battered crates, and the air is thick with frying fish and wood smoke. The surgeon buys lemon balm and presses it into a glass vial for the sick. A chamberlain haggles for honey to soothe children's throats. Sailors swap songs with local boys who leap from rocks. A parrot taken from a trunk squawks at passers-by and startles a maid into laughter. A cooper repairs a keg while an old woman sells loaves warmed on a brick stove. Even small trades feel diplomatic. A barrel of salted cod may secure a pilot. A crate of brandy lubricates conversation. Such moments are porous, joy and commerce threading through anxiety. A market that seems small and yet matters by keeping bodies seated against the ocean's demand. Not all stops are calm. At one anchorage, a whisper of a French patrol near the channel, overheard from a merchant, sends a cold shadow through the convoy. Orders snap into place. Naval guns are primed. Pilots are retained. The optimism of shore time compresses into tense readiness as captains study charts anew. It is a reminder that no harbor is beyond the reach of war. Safe ground can be an island of illusion. As the convoy prepares to leave, crates are recounted, fresh water stowed, and the small graces of shore packed back into trunks. Men who had tasted flat ale and fresh bread brace for the ocean's appetite. Pilots take final payment and step into a skiff. The gangway creaks and closes. Lanterns dim, sails fill. The fleet's wake picks up its old rhythm, and the islands shrink to dots on the chart. Ahead rides a human problem that outstrips geographies. A child who coughed ashore now coughs deeper, fever warming. The surgeon checks remedies and counts his shortages. Medicine may be carried, but some illnesses will reveal whether a voyage will reach a new capital with its life intact. The convoy steams away, islands disappearing, and the small care taken on a hillside, herbs gathered by a fisherman, lingers as both comfort and precarious hope. You learn a sea's true length only by living inside it. At first, the crossing wears the camouflage of routine. Days fold into watch rotations. 4 hours on, 8 hours off. The ship becomes a machine of small habits. Dawn smells like brine and tar. Noon feels like a hard, flat glare on canvas. Nights are a slow unspooling of stars. People measure time by little things that are not clocks. How many times the cook boils the ship's kettle in a week, which hammocks have dried since the last squall, whether the surgeon has seen fewer or more coughs in the span of 3 dawns. The monotony breeds a close attention to particulars, the exact pitch of the masts when wind shifts, the way a creak in a timber signals a need for care, the soft abrasion of salt on a cheek no towel fully wipes away. Shipboard life organizes itself into visible tiers and invisible exchanges. Officers keep maps and logs, ministers write dispatches and argue policy by lamplight, clerks try to preserve the state's record, under the constant threat of damp and ink that runs. Below decks, stewards organize rations and the surgeon tends to nausea and fever. Servants stitch, launders, and press shirts to maintain appearances even when the swell wants only practicality. Sailors, whose lives usually belong to weather and rope, find themselves buffeted by the strange sociology of a traveling court. Nobles request certain dishes, officers demand discipline, and yet in the seam of necessity, everyone finds tasks that cross rank. A minister may hand a coil of rope to a seaman, a sailor may be invited to address a minor dispute among household staff. The crossing compresses hierarchy into a pragmatic choreography. Boredom is dangerous in a different register than storms. It sharpens small resentments and amplifies rumor. Idle hours fill with stories, accounts recalled from ports left behind, gossip about colonies, whispered predictions of what Rio might be like. People write letters in cramped script, folding them into envelopes that may never reach their destinations without the right channels. These private notes become a parallel archive, pleas for salaries to be paid, instructions for household servants left ashore, requests for favors once the court sets itself up. When at sea, paper is both an instrument of authority and a fragile promise. Food organizes morale. The galley is the court's most practical ministry. Fresh meat runs out early, salted provisions and hard biscuit define the daily menu. Officers insist on preserving a semblance of table order for the regent and the higher households. A place setting, a brief ceremony of silver and linen. But for most the meal is rationed and repetitive. Moments of culinary relief, an unexpected barrel of fresh water or a crate of citrus bought at an island, are celebrated almost theatrically. Those small pleasures pass like contraband joy, shared, savored, then recounted until the memory fades into the long ledger of the voyage. Health is a tribal preoccupation. Seasickness levels the proud and the poor. Even powerful courtiers feel the indignity of a body that refuses land-bred control. The surgeon is more than a medic. He is the judge of whether a child's cough is a passing cough or the beginning of something deadly. In cramped infirmaries, remedies are bandaged in mixture, lemon juice for scurvy's thinning shadow, warm broths for fever, poultices for wounds. Burial at sea is a ritual of gravity and necessity when misfortune takes the worst. A brief service, a weighted shroud, a name spoken and released to the deep. These losses are recorded, sometimes only in private ledgers, and they leave small hollows that haunt cabins and walkways. Discipline and boredom breed creativity. Deck games start as a way to count watches and become elaborate wagers to keep sailors' hands busy. A young page invents a cadence that becomes a boat song. A steward makes a small theater of folded paper and acts out household scenes for children who miss a palace stage. Artists, clerks, and even bored officers draw sketches of portscapes they recall or the faces they meet. These hurried images later become souvenirs and, for the family of a minor courtier, a rare portrait of a life that shifted continents. Politics travels even on slow water. Dispatches pass between vessels. A minister reads aloud the latest dispatch, and the convoy stitches decisions into its daily rhythm. The regent's voice, soft in private but decisive in public, still governs in microtones. Appointments are debated below decks on tables strewn with paper. Some decisions are practical. Which naval stores must be saved? Which colonial posts must be confirmed on arrival? Other choices are symbolic. Which ceremonies to preserve? Which provincial officials to bring to favor? All are shadowed by the knowledge that what is decided in transit will meet a new social geography on the other shore. Threats do not sleep. Privateers and enemy cruisers are discussed with a mixture of pragmatic fear and informed contempt. The convoy's escorts maintain a careful watch, skimming away when scouts report suspicious sails, forming defensive geometries that make attack costly. Much of the danger is probabilistic. What might happen if the wind shifts, if a storm scatters vessels, if a ship's rigging fails at the wrong moment? Each captain keeps contingency plans and a private ledger of worst-case scenarios. Small economies emerge to lubricate the crossing. Favors are traded, a seam is repaired in exchange for a bottle of preserved fruit. A bottle of spirits is passed for a favorable stitch in a warrant. Money changes hands not merely as currency, but as trust. The court's clerks keep the official accounts, but an informal set of obligations ensures that daily life continues. These exchanges, sometimes invisible to formal history, are the warp that keeps the human tapestry stitched. After weeks that seem both inflated and compressed, people begin watching the horizon as if it were a face they expect to recognize. Conversations change tone, eyes sharpen, idle sketches gather detail. Men and women adjust clothing for the warmer air they anticipate. Sails are set differently. Officers read maps aloud with renewed attention. Sails that had served as passive roofs become instruments tuned for arrival. And then, because every ocean has its sudden mercies, someone smells land before they see it. A greener scent carried faintly on a current. The particular note of soil after a long salt hunger. Lookouts stand with bodies lean forward. Binoculars are passed. The deck's creak seems to stretch. For a long moment, the ship holds still, caught between the thousand-day rhythm of the crossing and the single second when shore slips into view. The long crossing has done its work. It has altered the bodies, rubbed new textures into the court's social fabric, and tested the logistics of a moving state. What awaits on the other side will rewrite more than timetables. Land arrives like punctuation, sudden, undeniable, and oddly intimate. At dawn, a lookout's cry slices the cold. Land! And the convoy leans as one. Men tumble from hammocks, shaking sleep from shoulders, testing whether their feet remember land before the mind fully processes it. The horizon, which had been an even gray for weeks, acquires edges, a dark line of hills, a scatter of white houses, a chapel spire puncturing the sky. For those who have lived by compass and watch, seeing land first is less a map than a reclaiming of bodily expectation. The souls can imagine soil before the head agrees. The approach to Rio is theatrical. Mountains rise abruptly from the shore, green shoulders lifting behind red-tiled roofs. The bay is a bowl of masts. Small fishing craft bob like punctuation on the water. A scent comes aboard, layered and strange after months of salt. Warm, sun-baked earth, the faint sweetness of fruit, and wood smoke from distant fires. Faces on deck soften with the smell. Talk grows quieter, as if people are reluctant to break the spell that arrival brings. Local pilots take ships in, with an authority honed by tide and memory. They come aboard after quick, no-nonsense exchanges, step lightly on timbers, and consult charts with practiced fingers. Their knowledge is intimate, where a hidden shoal waits, how a current curls after heavy rain, the subtle shift of wind between two headlands. Captains defer. Under a pilot's direction, sails are trimmed and anchors planned. Vessels thread into the bay with deliberate care. From deck to deck, eyes register the same details. A fort silhouette, warehouses stacked along the quay, fishermen hauling nets. The court watches with multiple eyes. Ministers read the skyline like ledgers, which houses might suit receptions, where warehouses could hold state silver and papers, what buildings might be converted into tribunals. Other faces show private feeling. Courtiers who had left palaces in haste now examine chimneys and balconies with a tremor that mixes relief and loss. A chamberlain organizes disembarkation with a calm he had no license to show at sea. Who will step ashore first? Which trunks must go ahead? Which offices require immediate reconstitution? Disembarkation is both muscle and ritual. Gangways lower and small boats ferry trunks through spray. Porters move with an economy of motion that steadies the cargo's political weight. Clerks stamp receipts, sailors haul crates, and local dignitaries come aboard bearing both welcome and petitions. They bring casks of provisions and lists of grievances. Clerks fold both into new entries and seal them with ink and wax. The colony performs deference as performance, bows and salutes, but each gesture also carries transaction, favors to be logged, and obligations to be remembered. The city reshapes itself around the arriving court. Spacious houses near the harbor are repurposed as reception rooms. Warehouses become temporary repositories for crown papers and coin. Chapels assume royal rights and merchant halls convert into audience chambers. Clerks set out benches and ledgers by lamplight. The first decrees are drafted and sealed. Practical needs, customs to reopen, courts to be convened, commissaries to be appointed, press for attention. If commerce and credit are to resume their ordinary flows, administration must move quickly from provisional notes to durable records. Rio's social fabric resists simple occupation. The city is composed of planters and merchants who see opportunity in proximity to metropolitan power, free people of color and Creole elites who watch legal adjustments for signs of mobility, enslaved people whose lives are governed by market and violence, soldiers and sailors seeking pay and billets. Each group interprets the court's presence through its own lens. Merchants hope for stabilized trade and protections. Planters calculate patronage. Many enslaved people look at the arrival with wary eyes, some hoping enforcement might change, others knowing that a crown nearby does not dissolve the machinery of bondage. Everyday textures register the collision of worlds. Market stalls along the quay sell salted cod, roasted coffee, tropical fruit, and bundles of beans piled like dark promise. A palace cook studies spices and quietly calculates how court menus might alter. A maid bites a sun-warmed mango and laughs at sweetness stolen back from months of ship rations. Languages layer in the streets, metropolitan Portuguese softened by local cadences, African tongues at the docks, Creole mixes and market calls, forming a soundscape the arriving court will have to learn to navigate in order. Ceremony follows necessity. The regent is received in formal audience by colonial authorities. Petitions are presented, and military commanders offer assurances of order. The reception is theater and governance in one. It reassures merchants and soldiers that authority functions, while binding local elites into metropolitan circuits of patronage. Behind the display, paperwork must catch up. Appointments confirmed, customs officers reappointed, military billets clarified so that supply lines and credit can resume functioning. Private moments thin the public display. A noblewoman on a balcony watches a slave market below, with an expression that resists easy reading, sympathy braided with habitual distance. A page dashes to the quay to buy oranges for children who have never tasted such fruit. A clerk, hands still stiff with salt, pauses to write a letter home that may carry instructions about puasa favors and the small logistics his family will need. These gestures stitch private life into a larger fabric, households reknitting themselves within the choreography of a transplanted monarchy. Arrival is not settlement. Harbor duties must be regulated, registers fully established, and the balance of power between local governors and metropolitan appointees negotiated. The regent's presence will change commerce and law, but those changes will be layered, contested, and slow. For now, the court steps ashore into a city that will host it. A mounted messenger hurries toward the governor's house with a sealed packet, whose instructions may test loyalties and reorder a small but consequential list of appointments. An early measure of how metropolitan rule will find purchase on new soil. Arrival is a transaction of air and light. Rio greets the convoy with heat that sits heavy on the skin, a brightness that makes gilt shimmer and ink glint in new ways. Where Lisbon's mornings had been sharp with coal and salt, Rio's dawn smells of sun-warmed earth and coffee beans drying on patios. The city folds itself around the bay. Red tile roofs climb green slopes. Churches insist on prominence from their perches, and narrow lanes run like veins between houses. For a court that expected a colonial outpost, the city's immediacy is disorienting and promising in the same breath. They do not so much enter as take possession. The regent's arrival is met with protocol and improvisation. Governors' houses are offered, spacious residences near the water, repurposed as audience rooms and offices. Warehouses along the quay become provisional archives. Vaulted rooms are pressed into service as council chambers. A palace that had been planned in distant Lisbon must be made anew with local timber, skilled masons, and the domestic furniture that trudge the Atlantic. Servants wheel trunks up narrow staircases. Clerks set ink to paper under the bright, unmoving light of Rio's mornings. The labor of making a capital begins with small, very physical tasks. Immediate governance needs force the regent into decisive acts. The court cannot simply float above colonial life. It must be woven into local administration or risk chaos. Orders are drafted to regularize customs, to appoint provisional magistrates, and to secure naval stores. The practical is urgent. Where will legal decrees be published? How will courts be convened? How will colonial trade be stabilized so that merchants and planters can plan harvests and send ships without fear? The answers are both administrative and political, and they arrive fast because smoke travels faster than ships once a ruler's seal is in motion. One of the first and most consequential measures is economic, an opening that will reorient Atlantic commerce, The regent issues decrees that loosen the old mercantile bonds that had restricted the colony's trade to the metropolis. Ports are declared open to friendly nations. Crates of British manufactures and letters of credit begin to circulate with new ease. Merchants feel the change as an immediate adjustment in ledger columns, newly available goods, new partners, different premiums. For planters, the possibility of direct trade rearranges calculations about planting, shipment, and credit. A single administrative act here reframes markets and introduces long-term shifts that will ripple through plantations, warehouses, and counting houses for decades. Printing presses arrive with peculiar symbolic importance. Where once proclamations trickled by dispatches, the ability to print quickly in the city turns law and announcement into public phenomena. A royal printing office is set up to produce decrees, bulletins, and eventually newspapers, tools that convert authority into distributed text. Clerks learn to run type as well as ledgers. Scribes who once copied by hand now oversee presses that can reproduce a decree many times over. The written word acquires a new immediate publicness in the colonial capital. That publicness will shape opinion, commerce, and the slow politics of loyalty and dissent. Public life reshapes quickly under the court's practical gravity. Where mansions stand empty or underused, they are refitted for audiences and receptions. Military barracks expand. The harbor sees a new traffic of government vessels arriving to exchange goods and personnel. New uniforms appear in parades. New titles are confirmed at tables where councillors drink coffee and trace plans on maps. The social topography of the city, who sits where at a dinner, who gets first audience, which family receives a title, shifts under the new gravitational pull. Local elites learn the dance of metropolitan patronage as agents of power knock on doors and promise favor in exchange for loyalty. But transformation is double-edged. The court's presence accelerates creases already present in colonial society. Free people of color and Creole elites see opportunities for administered clemency or for appointment. They move to position themselves within the new circuits of favor. Enslaved people, who supply labor to the plantations and households that benefit from metropolitan attention, feel new pressures, increased demand, shifting labor expectations, and, sometimes, hope sparked by rumor of reform. The reality is complicated. A crown nearby does not translate mechanically into emancipation or protection. The court inherits and amplifies pre-existing hierarchies even as it creates new administrative levers. Daily textures make the political intimate. The regent's table is set with new fruits, mango, guava, citrus, whose smells fill rooms that once knew only preserved meats. Palace kitchens adapt recipes with spices and local produce. Cooks learn to make cassava and to simmer sauces they had not known in Lisbon. A chambermaid breathes the scent of coffee roasting for the first time and writes a small note that will later be folded into private correspondence. Children who had grown aboard ships run across patios and discover courtyards. Their laughter becomes a small soundtrack to a city trying to accommodate the monarch's rituals. Infrastructure pressures are immediate and visible. The demand for housing sends rents up. Warehouses are pressed into service. Roads and plazas, already strained by colonial traffic, see fresh wear. Officials scramble to invent forms for offices that did not exist here in the same number. The regent's household requires printers, lawyers, secretaries, and a small army of clerks. These roles create sudden employment and a new local class whose livelihoods are tied to metropolitan favor. Cultural effects appear too. Artists and artisans, painters, sculptors, instrument makers, receive new commissions as the court repurposes local spaces for European forms. The arrival of the Royal Library and movable cultural objects creates an ambiance that encourages intellectual life. Salons form, lectures are proposed, and a new public becomes possible. Students and young professionals, who previously had to travel to Europe for higher learning, find new proximity to metropolitan institutions. These seeds will grow over time into a different civic life, but their planting begins with the mere physical presence of the court. Even amid bustle, personal edges remain sharp. A nobleman writes home about the difficulty of reproducing courtly formality in a courtyard that smells of humidity. A surgeon worries aloud about a lack of certain medicines. A bishop preaches about duty and empire, while his congregation listens with mixed feelings. The court's arrival is never a single story, but a weave of practical administration, social choreography, and private adaptation. The title of capital will be assumed slowly, by law and custom both. For now, the regent sits in houses not yet built for him, signs decrees in rooms retooled by haste, and sets in motion transformations whose consequences only future seasons will fully register. The city will be remade by policy and by daily touch. The small acts of servants, the appointments by ministers, the contracts signed on warehouse steps. At dusk, the regent stands on a balcony, looking over the bay where boats still drift like punctuation. Below, the city shifts under the weight of an unexpected court. Its drains, its markets, its people, beginning to accommodate a sovereign transplanted by war, sea, and administrative will. Change arrives like a tide, slow at first and then relentless. Streets reshape themselves under new feet. Rio's neighborhoods begin to reorder as the court's requirements press outward from the bay. Grand houses are refitted into offices. Shaded patios become salons. Warehouses once stocked with sugar and leather are reorganized into archives where ledgers pile under oilcloth. The municipal rhythm tightens. Magistrates who once met twice a month now keep daily hours. Clerks copy registers late into humid nights. Post riders adjust routes to deliver decrees to the interior. The city's practical anatomy, roads, bridges, and markets shift. Markets pulse with a different tempo. Where local trade had followed harvest cycles and merchant networks, now a new demand arrives. The court requires fresh fruit, coffee, European goods, and servants. Bakers expand ovens, butchers work earlier, tailors stitch uniforms for newly appointed officers. Street vendors adapt. Hawkers learn the names of foreign morsels the court requests. The smell of roasted coffee becomes a persistent current through lanes, and merchants speak openly of new credit lines and newly forged partnerships. Architecture becomes practical and symbolic. Temporary audience chambers are created in former warehouses. Canopies are hung, benches set, banners displayed. More lasting projects are launched. Masonry crews repair facades and reinforce balconies to accommodate promenades and processions. Roads that were muddy in the rainy season are improved so carriages can pass with less hazard. Bridges are rebuilt to manage heavier traffic. Urban change aims to make the city both serviceable and ceremonially presentable. Administration expands in numbers and complexity. The regent's household spawns new bureaus, financial clerks, a royal printing office, legal scribes, and a small diplomatic corps. Men who had been junior clerks find themselves promoted into roles that demand rapid learning. A law office becomes a hub for petitions. A warehouse turns into a depot where military stores are inventoried. The imprint of metropolitan governance is everywhere. Seals on doors, freshly appointed officials' brass nameplates, and the steady register of new salaries and obligations. Social life is rearranged by proximity to favor. Families jockey for position. Dinners become minor courts where alliances are made and promises exchanged. Local elites who can host the regent or a minister find their houses polished and their names whispered in corridors. Free people of color and Creole merchants navigate a more complicated terrain. Some secure contracts and positions previously difficult to access, while others find that metropolitan hierarchies reproduce exclusion and limit social mobility. Public rituals expand and adapt. Religious processions include petitions for the sovereign, military parades mark anniversaries, public proclamations are read in plazas where previously only local notices were posted. The printing press turns decrees into objects that travel, broadsheets and gazettes that circulate in coffeehouses and taverns. These venues become reading rooms where the population deciphers decrees and debates their meaning. The visible enactment of law, seals impressed, proclamations posted, makes authority legible in daily streets. Cultural life is both imported and improvised. Painters receive commissions to decorate salons. Musicians are hired for the regent's table. Scholars gather in improvised libraries to study books that cross the ocean. European fashions are adapted to tropical climate. Musical tastes mix local rhythms with metropolitan airs. Courtly taste and local craft cross-pollinate. Cooks introduce new dishes made with cassava and tropical fruits. Tailors adapt silk patterns to lighter linens, and artisans incorporate decorative motifs and practical adjustments. Infrastructure strains quickly. The arrival of functionaries increases demand for water, food, and housing. Warehouses fill with paper and coin that must be guarded. Hospitals must accommodate illnesses that accompany increased movement. Roads need repairs accelerated beyond municipal capacity. Administrative weaknesses surface. A shortage of trained clerks, gaps in the commissariat, and unpredictable channels for tax revenue. The court must improvise solutions while its presence itself increases the city's logistical load. The legal order reasserts itself through practice and performance. Courts convene in improvised spaces. Jurists trained in European law sit beside local lawyers familiar with colonial practice. Petitions arrive demanding office, money, or redress. The regent's scribes sort them into priority piles. Authority is performed as much as declared. A magistrate's bench, a public reading, a stamped document. These acts make law legible and enforceable in the rhythm of everyday life. Private hardship and domestic recalibration continue alongside public ceremony. Families who followed the court endure cramped apartments. Servants grow exhausted by pace and heat. A surgeon frets over outbreaks of fever in a crowded quarter. Yet daily kindnesses persist. A neighbor shares a pot of soup during a heat wave. A clerk advances wages quietly to a dismissed man. Human compassion stitches continuity into the city's transformation, even as official channels stumble. Tensions simmer beneath the surface. A warehouse dispute over landed goods becomes a test of influence. A petition denied in an office becomes the gossip of salons and the fuel of faction. The city's small wars over rent, market stalls, and access to the regent rumble like subterranean fault lines. How these tensions resolve will shape who prospers and who is left in the wake of a transplanted court. As dusk settles, lanterns flare along the bay, reflecting in water that now carries more boats and more secrets. In rooms repurposed as offices, clerks bend to ledgers under oil light, tallying the costs of a city remade. Outside, the sounds of haggling and prayer continue, underscoring an uneasy synthesis of metropolitan will and colonial life. The monarchy has arrived. The city has begun to answer its presence with accommodation, resistance, and rumor. The next moves, legal, economic, and personal, will determine whether this enforced capital becomes a durable center of power or a temporary stage for an uncertain empire. The arrival of a court is as much an economic earthquake as a diplomatic maneuver. For merchants, the change is immediate. Ledgers are amended by lamplight, premiums are renegotiated, and shipping schedules are rewritten to seize new opportunity or to protect against new danger. On the quay, clerks and factors move with a nervous precision. Contracts that had lain quiet for months are reopened. Buyers and shippers haggle over altered timetables. Letters of credit are hastily redrawn. The administrative decision to expand port access reshapes the merchant calculus. Colonial harbors that once traded almost exclusively with Lisbon now find routes and partners opening from farther afield. Brokers and counting house clerks keep lamps burning late into the night, working sums that will determine fortunes and failures. Supply chains reconfigure with visible speed. Warehouses brim with goods unloaded from newly admitted ships and then thin as buyers claim consignments. Planters in the interior of the colony notice the price and availability of cloth and tools shifting. Shopkeepers in the city watch English textiles and manufactured wares appear on their shelves where, until recently, such items were rare. The rhythm of commerce quickens and the pulse of the port begins to beat to a different tune. Opportunity arrives, but it brings competition and uncertainty in equal measure. Insurance and underwriting react to the altered map. Underwriters add new calculations to their ledgers: the protective value of a sovereign's presence in port, the increased hazard of hurried, crowded storage, and the epidemiological risk of densely quartered people and goods. Some premiums fall where stability seems to have improved. Others rise where the new bottlenecks amplify potential loss. Brokers demand clearer stowage procedures, documented chains of custody, and sometimes the escort of naval vessels for high-value consignments. The military becomes a visible instrument of economic order. Barracks swell as regiments, marines, and naval detachments arrive to guard docks and to patrol the roads that link warehouses and markets. Cannon are emplaced on headlands and gun carriages are rolled into plazas, where their silhouettes perform both deterrence and authority. Merchants sleep better when there is a steady line of disciplined footfalls outside the counting house. Creditors breathe easier when occupation troops reduce the risks of opportunistic seizure. Law follows force and finance with a speed that surprises some and reassures others. Judges, notaries, and scribes are summoned to reconstitute a functioning bench in the colonial capital. The law operates through ceremony as much as through text. Proclamations read aloud in public squares, seals impressed on parchment, judgments entered in ledgers displayed for inspection. The visible performance of a court, an audience in the plaza, a stamped decree, translates metropolitan commands into local, enforceable reality. That visibility is essential. Contracts only matter if you can make them stick. Administration is practical, often brutally so. A damaged bale of sugar will be examined, witnesses sworn, and stowage procedures documented before a determination is recorded and enforced. A late payment can lead to attachment of goods. A dispute over customs assessment can result in a formal inquiry and the temporary sequestration of merchandise. Soldiers and naval officers serve subpoenas and provide custody. Clerks copy depositions under the glare of oil lamps. The machinery of adjudication matters because it turns dispute into process and process into predictability. Yet law is contested ground. Merchants petition for deferments, exemptions, or clarifications of newly issued tariffs. Local elites press for appointments and favors that will secure commercial advantage. Colonial administrators argue about the degree to which metropolitan edicts should be adapted to local practice. Technical quarrels over measurement, the phrasing of a tariff, or a weight standard are often proxies for larger fights about access to markets, to government contracts, and to the patronage networks that distribute scarcity and privilege. Fiscal pressure intensifies every conflict. Revenue officers must balance the immediate needs of provisioning troops and maintaining the regent's household with the longer horizon of sustainable finances. Coin circulates rapidly through vaults and warehouses. Promissory notes and letters of credit are renegotiated in the counting houses and in private parlors. When bankers withdraw or credit tightens, suppliers demand cash on delivery. Delays in payroll provoke grumbling in barracks and among contractors, and the treasurer's ledger becomes a political instrument as much as a book of accounts. Where speed and scarcity collide, improvisation and favoritism appear. Supply contracts sometimes go to firms with connections to influential patrons. Tariff exemptions may be quietly arranged for favored merchants. Contemporary petitions and later audits record complaints of profiteering and abuse. Many of these arrangements are pragmatic responses to the urgency of provisioning a transplanted capital, but pragmatic expedients also plant the seeds of later legal suits and factional feuds. Between ledgers and litigations, humane acts stitch daily life together. A clerk advances his last coin to a soldier's wife. A foreman splits a crust with a coughing seaman. The royal surgeon trades a vial of medicine for a baker's loaf. These small economies of care do not appear in official registers, yet they are the social glue that keeps households and neighborhoods functional when formal channels fray. As courts find their feet and soldiers secure the streets, market engines begin to hum with a new, if precarious, rhythm. Trade restarts, ledgers balance more reliably, and the transplanted government learns the contours of its practical reach. Still, not everyone accepts the reshaping. Petitions stack in stairwells, salons hum with factional murmurs, and networks of influence tighten like webs in the corridors of power. In council chambers and taverns alike, the question grows sharper and more urgent. Who will ultimately control commerce and law in a capital moved by war, sea, and haste? Art arrives like a soft echo of power, a spillover of money, taste, and the need to be seen. When a court moves, it brings not merely laws and ledgers, but a demand for representation. Portraits must show faces newly important. Salons need decoration. Music must be played in unfamiliar courtyards. The transplanted monarchy turns domestic display into an administrative necessity. Likenesses affirm legitimacy, salons stage patronage, and printed images circulate authority. For artists, and for the artisans who make frames, prepare canvases, and grind pigments, the arrival of the regent is an extraordinary market opening. Studios appear without ceremony. A painter sets up an easel in a cool, high room whose tiled floor drinks humidity and oil equally. Linseed and turpentine smell sharp under the afternoon sun. Drying varnish glows like an old varnished page. Apprentices stretch canvas and mix pigments in metal basins. A master measures skin tones by the light that slips through jalousied windows. Portrait painters are in demand. Ministers request an image that will travel back to Europe. Merchants commission likenesses to announce a new status. And local elites purchase likenesses that signal proximity to metropolitan favor. Each brushstroke is both an aesthetic act and a political investment. Commissions are pragmatic and symbolic. Councils order banners and ceremonial hangings for audience chambers. A wealthy merchant pays for a large canvas to decorate a hall where favors will be negotiated. A bishop funds altarpieces that underline ecclesiastical authority. Craftsmen in wood and metal find work producing frames and mounts. Gilders work late into humid nights, applying leaf in thin, careful layers until a frame's edge flashes like coin. Sculpture workshops, if small at first, are tasked with busts and medallions, objects meant to fix identities in bronze or plaster for the city's public spaces. Music becomes portable court. Chamber ensembles adapt metropolitan repertoire to local instruments. A violin's varnish hums over open patios as dawn leaks heat into the courtyard. Musicians, whether imported or found in the colony, play for morning audiences and for late dinners where ministers and merchants negotiate policy between courses. The regent's table needs a soundtrack. Minuets, sacred motets, and the occasional opera overture adapted for fewer voices. Music serves both pleasure and function. It marks time, smooths receptions, and lends ceremony to audiences where every gesture is calculated. Print culture feeds and amplifies artistic life. A royal printing press, when installed, multiplies images into pamphlets, broadsides, and reproductions of engravings. Sketches that would have been private are now transferred to copper plates and run through presses to be read in public squares or exchanged among merchants. Prints, maps, allegorical engravings, official portraits translate a single brushstroke into many copies and make a visual language available beyond palace walls. The printed image helps craft a public persona for a transplanted court and supplies a visual grammar that locals learn to interpret. The court's material needs shape local craft. Tapestries are ordered to hang in provisional salons, carpets are shipped, rolled with damp and dust, into rooms meant for receptions. Workshops are commissioned to produce banners and regalia for ceremonies. Tailors and embroiderers adjust metropolitan fashions to a tropical climate, lightening layers and substituting linens for heavier silks. A seamstress stitches a ceremonial sash with threads that glint like river light. A button maker stamps brass with monograms that will identify service and rank. Such small labor stitches spectacle to governance. Artistic exchange is not merely importation. Local forms and materials alter metropolitan taste. Tropical woods, vivid dyes, and local motifs seep into workshops. Painters who had trained in European techniques find themselves learning to render new light, sunlight that flattens shadows and makes color sing differently than in Lisbon's northern clarity. Musicians encounter rhythms they had not known before. Dances and percussion sometimes enter courtly entertainments as exotic curiosities and, slowly, as sources of genuine creative exchange. These hybridities will later shape distinctive schools of art and performance in the colony. Institutions form around need. Collections, boxes of prints, trunks of books, and the transported volumes of the Royal Library become the nucleus for public libraries and reading rooms. Artistic circles gather in rooms where coffee steams and conversation pushes from polite chatter into argument. Students who once had to cross an ocean to study art find teachers in a new and expanding cultural economy. Over time, the city will host more formal academies, and foreign missions of artists will come to train local talent. But even in the first seasons, the court's patronage creates a living market where skill pays shelter and exposure. Not all patrons act from pure taste. Some commissions are pragmatic gifts. They smooth local politics, reward loyalty, or seal agreements. A portrait presented to a colonial magistrate is as much a bribe as a celebration. A gilded chest becomes currency in networks of influence. The aesthetics of power are therefore bound to a transactional logic. Artists navigate this terrain. They maintain independence where possible, flatter where necessary, and sometimes refuse commissions that would ask them to falsify likeness or truth. The ethical grain of creative labor becomes a small moral arena in which reputation matters. There are limits and frictions. The sudden demand constrains supplies. Pigments imported from Europe arrive late, stretched, and expensive. Canvas must be rationed. Frames compete for skilled carvers. Apprenticeship systems are pressed as masters take on extra hands and rush work for state deadlines. Where agents hurry, quality sometimes falters, and disputes about payment and delivery appear in municipal courts. A patron who waits too long for a likeness may turn to another workshop. An artisan who delays a commission risks losing the favor that kept his family fed. Amid commerce and pragmatism, the artist's labor contains human tenderness. A painter who once painted for private families now paints a sick child, whose likeness will be kept in a locket. A musician plays a lullaby for a governess who has not heard one in months. These small acts, quiet and unpublicized, bind the transplanted court to the human textures of the city. Art becomes both ornament and sustenance, a language that folds private feeling into public display. As the first commissions are finished and hung, as salons fill and presses run, the colony begins to host a new kind of public, one threaded by taste, credit, and conversation. The artistic life that blooms will both advertise metropolitan rule and, over years, take root into forms that the metropolis itself will later study. But these developments need time, patronage, and moments of daring. A single unfinished portrait, a brushstroke abandoned because a patron withheld payment, sits in a studio window like an accusation against haste and want. What will the court choose? To patronize patiently and build institutions, or to treat art as a brief convenience? The answer will shape the city's cultural future. Diplomacy in Rio is a theater lit by lanterns and ledger paper, where power speaks softly and money listens. The court's arrival rearranges not only domestic administration, but the region's diplomatic map. Envoys and consuls appear as if drawn by a new sun. British officers who had escorted the convoy linger with dispatches. Merchants representing distant houses move to secure franchises. Ambassadors and vice consuls seek audience to renegotiate trade, protection, and privilege. The regent's household becomes a hub for conversations that have less to do with ceremony than with the slow arithmetic of alliances. Who will guarantee ports, under what terms, and at what cost to local prerogatives? Formal audiences are one thing, protocols observed with measured bows and the click of a seal. But much of diplomacy happens in less visible rooms. A British naval commander meets a minister in a shaded patio and traces a line on a damp map. A merchant arranges a supper, where the price of duties is discussed between courses. A consular aide passes a folded note in a public garden. These encounters are purposeful. The British fleet that protected the voyage had leverage to demand concessions, and it is no surprise that representatives who had watched the convoy through the Tagus now press for commercial advantage in the bowels of Brazil's ports. The language of negotiation is eclectic: guns and goodwill, credit and coercion. British officers offer the quiet threat of naval protection, while British merchants press for licensing and consular representation. The regent must weigh gratitude against sovereignty. The allies who saved his passage expect reciprocation in policy. That reciprocity can take many forms: exclusive contracts, favorable customs rates, or the placement of trusted consuls in key harbors. Every concession is recorded somewhere, and clerks keep those records with the nervous care of men who know that paper will be argued over for years. Local elites watch these bargains closely. Plantation owners and merchants of the colony evaluate what British proximity means for their crops, credit lines, and social standing. For some, the opening of ports promises new markets and prices. For others, it threatens the monopolies that hitherto sustain their position. Salons hum with a new language of calculation. Private gatherings become caucuses where favors are bartered beneath polite smiles. A merchant who secures a British partnership may find himself newly entreated by neighbors, seeking introductions and guarantees. The diplomatic presence creates new institutions. Consular offices are proposed and sometimes hastily erected to process shipping and legal disputes involving foreign merchants. The Regent's Council debates the terms for these offices, what jurisdiction a consul will have, how disputes with local courts will be resolved, and whether foreign flags will enjoy special protections in Brazilian ports. Each provision is both a legal technicality and a seed of future political alignment. Not everyone sees British influence as benign. Rumors, some accurate, some born of anxiety, circulate in taverns and salons. Whispers of preferential contracts, allegations of swifter justice for British claimants, and complaints about the social effect of a navy that now patrols nearby waters. Spanish and French diplomatic networks, where present, register worry or opportunism, sensing openings to recalibrate their own relations. The presence of a transplanted court in the hemisphere magnifies rivalries that had once been distant. The Atlantic becomes, in microcosm, a room where European power contends anew. Diplomacy reaches down into daily administration. The opening of ports, already debated as a practical necessity, must be framed in treaties and decrees. Ministries draft language about tariffs and consular fees. Clerks cross-reference existing commercial codes. Typographers set type for proclamations that will need to be read aloud in plazas and printed for merchants. Choosing a tariff rate is technical work, but its outcome reorders who profits, who loses, and who gains access to credit. For small shopkeepers in the city, a single tariff change means different cloth, new tools, and different prices for bread and nails. Negotiations are not always papered over with civility. Secret discussions sometimes take place with the urgency of men who feel history's pressure. A late-night meeting by candlelight may resolve an imperial appointment or decide who will receive a monopoly to supply salted meat. Such bargains, closed with a handshake and a sealed note, will surface in later petitions and audits as evidence of favoritism or necessity, depending on the fortunes of those involved. Religion and diplomacy entwine, too. Bishops host formal dinners where ecclesiastical patronage is used as diplomatic currency. A promise of an ecclesiastical benefice can be as persuasive as gold. Meanwhile, The church's moral authority is invoked in public declarations to legitimize political choices. Sermons are written to underline obedience to the sovereign and to smooth the reception of unpopular measures. Clergy thus become diplomatic actors, translating theological reassurance into political leverage. The human underside of diplomacy is visible in smaller gestures. A merchant offers a crate of special cloth to a foreign consul as a courtesy. A British officer arranges for a physician's supplies to be imported at reduced duty in return for logistical help. A Portuguese minister inquires after the health of a naval captain's child in a letter that mixes personal concern with a reminder of mutual dependence. These small acts, unnoticed by most records, lubricate the larger machinery of interstate relations. Yet the balance is delicate. Each concession to foreign interest risks alienating parts of the colonial social fabric, or entangling metropolitan authority in debts that will be hard to repay. The regent navigates these shoals with a mix of gratitude, calculation, and occasional brusqueness. His choices will determine whether Rio becomes a genuine capital with autonomous capacity or merely a dependency propped up by foreign power and mercantile calculation. As envoy depart and new consuls are proposed, a rumor spreads through the city that a treaty draft, one that might formalize expanded trade rights, has been seen in a minister's hand, and that its terms will soon be read aloud in a plaza. Men gather in taverns and counting houses to speculate. For many, the stakes are clear. The terms of that document could make merchants rich, authorize new offices, and tilt the balance of influence on an entire continent. Markets rearrange themselves around new rules, as if a map were being redrawn in ink and coin. The first economic shocks arrive as administrative edicts that land like stones dropped into still water. The regent's decision to open colonial ports to friendly nations turns the old mercantile geometry inside out. Where coastal planters and merchants had long sold chiefly to Lisbon, they now see ships riding in with English manufactures, Brazilian sugar finding new buyers, and a flow of credit that works on a different logic. For a city used to seasonal predictability, this is a kind of weather that changes the soil beneath people's feet. Credit is the story's new medium. Counters and ledgers that once registered routine consignments begin to record letters of exchange, bills discounted by foreign houses, and accounts settled through newly negotiated lines with British factors. The sound in office rooms changes, not just the scratching of quills, but the quick, mechanical ring of coin on wood as down payments are made, and the low murmur of agreements struck over cups of coffee. Where credit had been scarce or wrapped in local patronage, it becomes more liquid and more dangerous. Easier to access, yes, but also easier to call in during crisis. Institutions follow politics. New banks and financial houses arrive, or are chartered, with the explicit mission of mobilizing the colony's capital. These are not abstract measures. The city's slopes soon carry visible signs of finance. A stone office whose windows are swept each morning, a clerk who stamps a guarantee with the careful authority of a surgeon suturing a wound, a safe whose iron teeth clink with the sound of a country revaluing itself. The availability of institutional credit allows merchants to buy larger shipments and planters to mortgage future harvests for larger crops. Investment choices, once conservative, grow bolder. Infrastructure responds with the slowness of masonry and the speed of demand. Roads are repaired so carriages can carry goods inland without losing a wheel in the rain. Warehouses are built deeper and higher to handle faster turnover. Wharves are extended into the bay and cranes. Simple wooden capstans at first appear to lift heavier cargo. The visible labor of change is everywhere. Stonemasons sweat at arches, coopers hammer hoops, carpenters cut timbers that will become docks. The city's soundscape gains a new track. The rasp of saws, the thunk of masts landing in yards, the call of contractors seeking labor. Labor itself becomes a contested commodity. Plantation owners push for more hands and quicker harvests. Urban workshops need journeymen who can finish an order in days, not weeks. This demand breeds new markets for labor and for the politics that control it. Indenture contracts, temporary hires, and the expansion of a casual day labor market at the docks. For enslaved people, the economic uptick ripples in complex ways. Some experience greater churn as planters demand more shipments to meet foreign buyers. Others see small opportunities where Creole merchants contract work that allows a little autonomy. These shifts are morally fraught and humanly costly. Profit and coercion remain braided. Trade regulation becomes an instrument of local power. Which goods pay lower duties? Who receives exemptions? Officials create lists, stamps, and seals. Clerks write letters that will bind merchants to particular practices. Every tariff change is both a technical adjustment and a political favor. A lower duty on British cloth may open shelves to new styles, but it can also undercut local artisans. The politics of tariff making ends up as a proxy battlefield for influence. Merchant houses, colonial toll planters, and metropolitan financiers all vie to shape the rates that will determine winners and losers. Small entrepreneurs retool quickly. Tailors learn to stitch lighter fabrics brought in from English workshops. Coopers alter barrel sizes to match new shipping standards. A local milliner experiments with trims that flatter an English cut. These micro-adaptations are the visible forms of structural economic change. When a baker switches grain supply lines because new ships dock with different flour, you can trace the larger shift in everyday diet, household economics, and urban taste. The printing press amplifies economic effects. Broadsheets advertise new consignments, list auctions, and circulate prices. A single printed notice about an incoming cargo can change the liveliness of a market on the same day. Buyers arrive, credit is committed, and bargains are struck in the light before noon. The printing office becomes an engine not only of law but of liquidity. Information compressed into type that moves faster than any ship. Banking and bureaucratic reform also create new legal furniture. Contracts are standardized, negotiable instruments gain language that courts can enforce, and guarantors begin to appear in documents as if signers could assume a capacity that extends beyond personal reputation into institutional trust. For merchants, that is revolutionary. A promise backed by a bank is easier to trade than a promise backed only by a single merchant's word. Yet not all effects are immediate or contained. The influx of foreign goods can threaten small producers. The new credit systems can overextend borrowers. And speculative bubbles, always the ghost at the banqueting table, begin to haunt counting houses. Some houses expand successful operations. Others collapse under debts incurred to chase new markets. Contemporary ledgers record both triumphs and failures, and the tremor of that volatility is audible in taverns and court corridors alike. Uneasy asides follow. Merchants who prosper become patrons of politics. Contractors who win dock contracts climb social ladders. Clerks who manage government accounts build private fortunes through partnerships and by trading on information. These are slow accumulations of power that will have long shadow. When political alignment is required, economic interest will be ready with a hand extended. As scaffolding rises on new warehouses and a bank's shutters are painted for first opening, a sealed parcel is carried into a minister's office, typed, stamped, and guarded. Inside, its contents promise to rearrange credit further, a formal charter that, if signed, will give an institutional form to the colony's new financial life. Outside, dockworkers whistle a rhythm to the tide, unaware that what is about to be enacted in an upstairs room might stretch into decades of profit, politics, and consequence. The city waits to see whether this charter will be the seed of secure credit or the beginning of a new set of dependencies. There is a private geography to exile that a map cannot show, the rooms where people fold grief into routine, the courtyards where children relearn play, the cupboards that hold objects preserved against forgetting. The regent's household reorganizes itself around intimacy as surely as around administration. Suites that, once open to formal processions, are repurposed for quieter uses. A drawing room becomes a schoolroom where tutors rehearse Latin and navigation for an impatient prince. A chapel is kept half dark for hours of private prayer that no public service would show. In the humidity of Rio, the heavy silks of Lisbon are impractical. Wardrobes are lightened and relearned. Servants unbox linens that smell of sea and earth. The texture of new cotton against a skin that has known wool feels like a minor consolation. Children adapt with a surprising speed that adults envy. A young infante, used to palace corridors and the varnish of European marble, learns which patios collect sun and which steps hold a cool breeze. Governesses, who arrived with trunks of embroidery and lesson plans, find themselves improvising local curricula. Counting lessons now include trade goods the colony produces. Geography lessons map, not just Europe, but the wide Atlantic. And languages mix in odd, useful ways. The laughter of children on a tiled terrace becomes a small argument against homesickness. Their games reconfigure courtly order into something less solemn and more immediate. The private health of the household is perpetually negotiated. The queen's frail mind, already a public fact treated with delicate euphemism, remains a concern. Those around her guard against rumor but cannot hide care. A doctor's bath, a familiar blanket, a small procession to a chapel for ease of conscience. Nurses and attendants keep closer watch than before. The regimen of rest and gentle food is maintained against humidity and heat that worsen some ailments. The royal surgeon becomes as much a household figure as any steward. His cart of tinctures and his small herbal book consulted as often in private as in official dispensations. For many servants, the move changes everything. Some attendants gain promotions simply by being present and useful. A valet who manages to keep the regent's papers dry during a storm finds his salary adjusted and his future secured. Others are left behind, dismissed in the chaos, or intentionally retained ashore to run remaining estates. That choice often splits families. A footman who follows the court to a new capital sends back parcels and letters. The wife he left may wait months for a promised wage. Servants who travel become intermediaries between metropolitan expectation and colonial reality. They carry habits, recipes, and small rituals that keep a thread of Lisbon in the palace's new rooms. Private rituals become substitutes for lost places. A lady who once sat by the Tagus at dusk now lights a lamp at a small window that overlooks a courtyard, and in that small light, she recites prayers and lists the names of the house's absent people. Men who once took morning walks on Lisbon's promenades take to measured rides in the nearby hills. Their mounts spooked by unfamiliar birds and by the tropical scent of flowering trees. A chamberlain preserves the morning cup of tea as a sacrament, though tea must be rationed now and often replaced by local infusions until the next shipment arrives. Romance and tension find new channels. The cramped intimacy of a traveling court allows relationships to compress and accelerate. Courtiers who had been distant acquaintances become confidants on long voyages and then neighbors in a compact city. Friendships are tested by stretched wages and by the petty competitions of position. Jealousies bloom over invitations to a minister's small supper. Small kindnesses, an advance of pay, a private endorsement become currency. These private economies of favor do the work of survival and also the work of social sorting. Religion offers both solace and strategy. Private devotions, masses in small chapels, and quiet confessions sustain those who miss home. Bishops and chaplains become agents of both consolation and political framing. Sermons are drafted to affirm obedience under trying circumstances, while private counsel calms nerves and polices rumor. For many, a prayer offered in a hush becomes a daily contract against the instability of being a court outside its usual orbit. Exile sharpens material sentimentality. Objects take on a weight of memory that sometimes makes them more valuable than coin. A mother keeps a child's first shoe in a drawer. A minister carries a small, cracked portrait of his late father that he takes out at odd hours and studies as if it contained counsel. The Royal Library's volumes are read at night under lamplight, old marginalia suddenly precious, and trunks of silver that clink in storerooms become talismans of continuity. People worry for paper, petitions, seals, letters. If ink runs or a chest is lost, a life's work may vanish in a stroke of damp. Community forms in unexpected ways. Exiled households share information about suppliers and surgeons, swap servants when one family's nurse falls ill, and create informal networks to secure theater tickets or a place at a scarce table. A barber who knows how to cut hair for both hot climate and courtly coiffure becomes unexpectedly important. These micro-networks are the tissue of daily life, practical, reciprocal, and full of the small humiliations and kindnesses that bureaucrats never record. Yet the shadow of power remains. The regent's private griefs and decisions are always entangled with state needs. A family argument over a portrait's display might ripple into a question of precedence at a public reception. A private letter sent to Lisbon demanding the payment of a widow's allowance may become an official petition that shapes colonial payrolls. The personal and the political braid in ways that make private choices consequential. Then, on a humid afternoon, as a governess folds laundry and a young prince plays with an orange peel, a clerk enters with a sealed packet. The seal bears a familiar crest and handwriting pressed with the weight of oceanic time. Hands still damp from the wash, they look at the wax and feel the sudden, precise weight of home's voice. What the packet contains will test loyalties and force the court, to answer not only a diplomatic question, but a private demand that could unravel arrangements already painfully made. The end of exile is rarely a single moment. It is a seam stitched slowly by politics, weather, and the stubborn grit of people who must choose where to live. After more than a decade away, the court's long sojourn in Rio reached its resolution with a return to Portugal that was as much political as it was nautical. The regent's household, changed, seasoned, and reconfigured by years of tropical seasons, crossed the Atlantic again, this time with new knowledge and new claims. They left behind more than trunks and official seals. They left institutions that had taken root in soil that had learned to host metropolitan rule. For those who remained in Brazil, clerks who married locally, merchants who prospered, and communities that had adapted, the court's departure did not reverse the transformations it had set in motion. Memory, like a harbor, holds many things. The voyage home carried different cargo than the flight out. Papers now included not just state decrees, but reports, petitions, and accounts of how colonial commerce had changed under metropolitan presence. The regent's administrators carried with them a ledger of consequences, new legal precedents, pressed petitions for appointments, lists of favors granted, and the formal record of how colonial institutions had been retooled. Personal cargo mattered too. Portraits commissioned in Rio, musical scores created for tropical receptions, a small library of works acquired or produced in the colony, all spoke to the hybrid life the court had lived. Return meant negotiation. Portugal in the years after 1815 faced a Europe reordered by the Congress of Vienna, the pressures of British influence, and a domestic population changed by the strains of war and occupation. The regent, now returning to a kingdom that expected restoration and continuity, had to reconcile policies made from across an ocean with the realities of a homeland that had been reoccupied and was itself in need of repair. Reintegrating an administrative apparatus that had learned to operate from another hemisphere required compromises, appointments, and sometimes the painful business of accounting for favors and debts. Brazil's path, meanwhile, diverged from the mere temporary hosting of monarchy. The administrative openings, the presses, the institutions, and the networks of credit established during the court's stay became scaffolding for local ambitions. Creole elites who had tasted administrative power, and merchants who now traded more freely, began to imagine a political life that did not simply bow to Lisbon. When Dom Pedro, son of the returning regent, chose to stay in Brazil and later declared independence in 1822, that act did not come from nothing. It drew on the institutional and social changes that had been seeded during the years the court lived in Rio. Presses that printed proclamations, legal offices that argued jurisdiction, merchants who had new partners and credit lines, and a small but growing elite accustomed to being courted by sovereign poor on their soil. Legacy is both the obvious and the subtle. On the obvious side, the presence of the court accelerated Brazil's infrastructural and institutional development. Ports modernized, printing presses multiplied, legal and financial practices matured. Courts sat more regularly, civil offices expanded, and metropolitan administration had been, if only temporarily, transplanted into a new geography. On the subtler side, the move remade identities. Being Portuguese became differently inflected across an Atlantic map. Creole elites learned to act with metropolitan protocols. Artists integrated new forms. Cuisine and domestic practices hybridized. Children who had been born in Rio but raised in the household imagined their loyalties in layered ways. Memory is a contested thing. For some, the court's flight was a humiliation that exposed Portugal's vulnerability. For others, it was prudence that preserved sovereignty's continuity. In Lisbon, statues and chronicles remembered the survival of monarchy as a triumph of endurance. In Brazil, stories split. There were those who praised the economic openings and cultural investments the court had brought. There were others who mourned the intensification of systems, like slavery, that the court did not dismantle and sometimes deepened through new commercial incentive. It's necessary to hold both of these stories because history's moral ledger is rarely balanced on a single line. Human consequence threads through official accountings. Families who returned to Portugal sometimes found estates appropriated or changed. Others who stayed in Brazil gained property, positions, and marriage ties that anchored them locally. Servants who had kept households afloat in exile found new social positions, promoted, displaced, or married into local families. Artists who had learned new techniques from tropical light or local materials carried those innovations back across the ocean. Clerks and lawyers, those who learned to print, to register, and to adjudicate in the colonial capital, became beacons of administrative competence on both sides of the Atlantic. There are small, tender legacies too. A locket containing a child's sketch kept in a Lisbon drawer after the return. A recipe for a cassava stew that a palace cook folded into a metropolitan cookbook. A score of a minuet with a sudden bar that hints at a samba-like rhythm. These human artifacts show how lives braided. Institutional legacies cross into the everyday. Courts that convene more regularly, presses that fostered public debate, and port regulations that permitted new flows of goods. Together, they rebalanced markets and imaginations in ways still visible in subsequent decades. We must be honest about gaps. Records leave questions. Which private petitions were honored and which were sidelined? How many trunks of correspondence were lost to damp and shipworm? Which acts of patronage became the seeds of long corruption, and which became the scaffolding for legitimate public service? Historians reconstruct with the best evidence available: treaties, ledgers, decrees, and personal letters. But the human texture retains edges that archival paper cannot fully flatten. As the sea swallowed the wake of the ship that carried the last of the regent's household toward Lisbon, those who remained ashore in Brazil watched not only a vessel recede, but the tangible and intangible results of a risky, epochal experiment. A monarchy moved across an ocean preserved by timber and treaty, but one that left behind institutions and people who would remake a continent. The story closes with practical facts and with a quieter moral. Power travels like a tide, and when it moves, it reshapes not just administration and architecture, but habit, memory, and belonging. In the creased ledgers, in the printed broadsheets, and in the quick human acts of care and grievance, the voyage's meaning endures, messy, contested, and deeply human.